As I shared during the announcement time, our worship series during this season of Lent, that's the preparation for Easter, is an exploration of the places where we may find grace in the story of Les Miserables. Les Miserables is originally a novel written by Victor Hugo in the 1860s about some events that happened just about 30 years earlier. So not a lot of time and distance passed between some of the events and his fictionalizing them in this novel. And it is a story that deals with deep spiritual issues. Victor Hugo also wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, another big, thick novel that deals with deep spiritual issues. One of the things that I've come to appreciate about Hugo's work, though I've not actually read either of his novels, I've seen films and musicals based on them, is that Hugo does not shy away from the complexities of dealing with grace and mercy, the complexities of human relationships with one another, and themes of justice and betrayal and trust, of dealing with what it means to be good in a world that is rarely neatly falls into black and white categories of good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. And so Matt Rawls, who is a United Methodist pastor, has written this study in which he takes a look at some various themes through the lenses of different characters in the story. And today we look first at where we see grace in the story of the novel's primary protagonist, Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean is someone who we don't know a lot about his backstory, except that at some point he and his family end up deeply impoverished following the French Revolution. And he, in desperation to save his widowed sister's starving child, steals a loaf of bread. And for stealing a loaf of bread is sentenced to 5 years in the French prison system, which is incredibly cruel. It uses the prisoners as slave labor. During that time, and in part because of the cruelty of the system, Valjean cannot stand to remain and serve his 5 years, and so he makes multiple attempts at escape. And for each of those escape attempts, his sentence is lengthened. So that by the time we meet Jean Valjean, he is being released on parole after 19 years in a cruel and abusive prison system that used him for slave labor. And he is released with parole papers that not only must he present to everyone he interacts with in any way, but that label him a dangerous and hardened criminal. So as he's released with these papers, he's warned that failure to show up on a regular basis to his parole officer, or failure to show those papers, failure to identify himself as the hardened and dangerous criminal that he is, will result in returning to prison. So he goes out into the world and tries to begin a life, and finds that instead he cannot get a job, he cannot find lodging, that no one will even allow him to sit at a table in their tavern because he has these papers that have marked him a dangerous and hardened criminal. He resorts to trying to sleep in a doghouse and is run out by even the dog. And it is at this point that Valjean has given up on himself, on humanity, on the idea that there is any goodness in the world. He proclaims himself worse than even a dog and curls up to try to sleep outside in the bitter cold. It so happens that the place that he curls up to try to go to sleep outside in the bitter cold is the front yard of a man who has been nicknamed Monseigneur Bienvenu, Father Welcome. He's earned this nickname, we find out in the novel, because he has a bit of a reputation of relieving the overly rich of some of their excess in order to share it with the poor, a bit of a Robin Hood type. And he sees Jean Valjean out in his garden and knows that this won't do. And so he invites him into his home, welcomes him at his dinner table. They eat together. And in fact, he actually even uses the term, my honored guest, and then shows Valjean to a warm bed where he can spend the night and rest and stay as long as he needs. The welcome is open. Now, here's possibly the most relatable part of this story. This welcome is almost too much for Valjean to bear. His hardened sense of the world and its lack of goodness is such that it cannot be quickly undone by a warm meal and a comfortable bed. And so in the middle of the night, he seizes the opportunity while all in the household are sleeping, steals the silver plates from which he was served dinner, and slips out into the night. However, apparently for being a hardened and dangerous criminal, he's not a very sneaky one, because he doesn't get very far before being caught. And the police, automatically suspicious of how someone with such parole papers has silver plates in their bag, don't buy his story that they're a gift from the priest. And so they wake the whole household to present him before the priest so that the priest can press charges, galled by the story that he has given him the plates. And Valjean appears before the priest, ready to hear the words that will send him back to prison for the rest of his life. And instead, he hears it's true. The plates were a gift. But, sir, you rushed out so quickly, you didn't even take the very best, these candlesticks, and hands over the silver candlesticks from the center of the table. The priest dismisses the police, sends them on their way, thanks them for doing their duty, and then turns to Valjean and says, "Tonight, I have bought your soul for God. Take this silver and build an honest life." Now, in the musical, depending on the production, but many present this as sort of an instantaneous conversion for Jean Valjean, that in that moment of unexpected grace and deep kindness on the part of the priest, he is changed forever and sets his heart and his mind to be a good man from this point onward. Hugo's novel actually offers a little more nuance to the way in which that happens. It's true that this is a moment of deep conviction for Valjean, in which he sets his sight on becoming a better person, on doing right in the future, but has to wrestle with it a little more. In the novel, he actually, even after he leaves the priest's home with now the plates and the candlesticks, steals a coin from a little boy, and then is overcome with grief that so quickly he turned back to the old familiar ways of theft. And it's only over the course of the struggle that he begins to wrestle with what it means to be good. Now, both the musical and the novel and the film adaptations show that there are multiple points throughout Valjean's story where he must wrestle with, what is the choice that God would have me make? What is the choice that does the most good? What is the choice that most reflects the mercy that I have received? There's a point at which he has skipped out on parole, has refused to appear, has built another life under another name, and someone else is picked up by the police and accused of being Jean Valjean. And he faces the decision whether to go and clear that person's name, thus facing his own imprisonment, or to remain In the small town where he has become the mayor, where he has opened up a manufacturing factory where lots of people are employed and are dependent on the wages they make from his business in order to feed their families, and he wrestles with who he has the greater responsibility to. And he ultimately decides to appear and to clear the person's name, not to allow someone to go to prison as him. But then, later he learns that one of his factory workers had been turned out, kind of turned on by her fellow workers and sent out in the street to live in poverty. She eventually falls into physical despair, into a life of selling her body in every way. And when he finds her, he feels deep responsibility for the way that her life has turned out, in part because the foreman who threw her out did so to protect him and his business and his reputation. And so while he cannot change, this is Fantine, he cannot change Fantine's fate, he makes a promise to her that her daughter, Cosette, will always be cared for. Unfortunately, in order to keep that promise, he has to, again, slip the law, right? He has to escape Javert, who is the police inspector, and has to run away with Cosette and go into hiding. He does so successfully, raises Cosette, and then is faced with yet another dilemma. Does he allow Cosette to leave him? Does he face loneliness so that she might know love with her romantic interest, Marius? And at first he makes the wrong choice. Tries to take Cosette away. And then when he learns that taking Cosette away has driven Marius to go to the barricades and face a suicidal mission with the revolutionary uprising, he goes and joins it. And there he's faced with even more moral dilemmas. For one thing, that antagonist, Javert, the police inspector that's been haunting him for the whole story, appears as a spy to the revolutionaries and is found out. So they tie him up, and they decide the last one to leave the barricade will be charged with killing him. And Jean Valjean volunteers. And he's faced with an opportunity. A chance to kill his archenemy, the one who has haunted him and made his life terrible, the only one who knows really who he is and can ruin his life. And if he kills Javert, he can live the rest of his days in relative peace and anonymity, probably do a lot of good, not worrying about being thrown back in prison. And instead, he chooses mercy, firing his gun into the air and releasing Javert. And then Cosette's romantic interest, Marius, is injured gravely. And again, he has a choice. If he leaves Marius there to die of his battle wounds, no one will know he could have done any differently. He can go back to Cosette with the sad news of her beloved's death and comfort her and lead her through the grief process and know that she will never leave him alone. Or he can save Marius, offer Cosette a chance at the happiness she desires, at the risk that that happiness may take her away from him. And so he throws Marius over his shoulder and jumps down into the sewer and carries Marius through the sewer, through the city, back to safety. And at each of these points, the right answer isn't always clear. but we get a sense of his wrestling. And I have to say, this is probably an intensely Wesleyan story in which grace is a slow and difficult process, one with which we wrestle at every turn. Certainly, there's a moment of clarity for Jean Valjean where he is reawakened to the existence of goodness in the world around him and in himself. But the process of seeing that goodness come into reality, of placing it in interaction with everyday life, is slow and gradual and painstaking and sometimes heartbreaking. And I think about our gospel text this morning. The writer of Luke places this particular instruction very early in Jesus' teaching to the disciples. Early in the teaching to the disciples, he begins with this concept that you are expected to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And a reminder that the God we serve pours out kindness on the good and the wicked alike. That we have received mercy we couldn't begin to deserve. This is part of the foundation that Jesus sets for the disciples. Because what Jesus knows that the disciples don't is that there's going to come a moment where they stand in the garden at Jesus' side and soldiers come to take Jesus away, and everything in them will want to pull out their swords and defend Jesus. And Jesus is going to tell them to put those swords away. There's going to come many times when they face off with the Pharisees and the leadership of the religious institution in which they just want Jesus to decimate them. And instead, Jesus is going to offer a word of grace, a moment of mercy, even for those he knows will be responsible for his death. And so we're called, as those who consider ourselves followers of Jesus, to enter the struggle like Jean Valjean. Not to automatically know the right answers at every turn, but at every opportunity to look for the response that reflects the grace that we have received, that remembers the surprising gift of being called an honored guest, that remembers what it is not only to be offered pardon, but to have more love and more mercy lavished on us when we least deserved it. And to live with eyes that see the goodness in the world, in the hopes that the choices we make in our own struggle might be that moment of conviction for another, in which their perspective is changed and they're able to see God's goodness in the world around them and in themselves, and to begin their own path of accepting God's grace and God's redemption and God's mercy. And for these opportunities, difficult though they often are, we give thanks to God. Amen.